I remember my first day at Virion Tech like it was yesterday. The smell of new paint mixed with fresh carpet, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and that impossible feeling that my whole life was about to change. I was 25 years old, fresh out of business school with more ambition than sense, and determined to prove myself in the cutthroat world of tech. "Welcome aboard, Ethan," my new manager, Carla, had said, extending her hand with a warm smile that seemed genuine. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of confidence that comes from years of climbing corporate ladders. "We've heard great things about you. Ready to change the world." I smiled, feeling the weight of possibility settle on my shoulders. This is it, I thought. The start of something great. The beginning of my legacy. The office was modern, sleek, all glass and chrome and exposed brick. My cubicle was small but positioned near the windows, with a view of the city skyline. I set up my laptop, arranged my few personal items, a photo of my daughter Emma, then just 5 years old, and a motivational quote my father had given me. "Success isn't owned, it's leased. And rent is due every day." I had no idea how prophetic those words would become. That first week, I worked 14-hour days, learning systems, meeting teams, absorbing everything like a sponge. I wanted to be indispensable. I wanted to matter. My colleagues seemed friendly enough, offering to grab lunch, explaining the unwritten rules of office politics. But I was too focused to pay attention to the warning signs, the subtle hierarchies, the whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. I was too busy trying to prove I belonged. For 10 years, I lived and breathed that company. Late nights became my normal. Skipped holidays turned into a badge of honor. Birthdays forgotten, anniversaries missed, my daughter's soccer games watched via shaky live stream from my office. All for the next project, the next deal, the next milestone that would prove my worth. Every time someone quit, and people quit often at Virion, I stayed. I absorbed their responsibilities, picked up their projects, became the institutional memory that kept departments functioning. When the company went through its first major crisis, a product launch that failed spectacularly and cost millions, I was there at 3 a.m. helping salvage what we could. When our biggest client threatened to leave, I spent 6 weeks rebuilding that relationship from scratch, eventually not just saving the account, but expanding it. My reward? A corner office on the 8th floor and the trust of the CEO, Marcus Holloway. Or so I thought. Marcus was the kind of leader people wrote books about, charismatic, visionary, always 3 steps ahead. He'd stop by my office randomly, asking my opinion on strategy, bringing me into high-level discussions. "Ethan," he'd say, "you get it. You understand what we're building here." Those words fueled me through exhaustion, through doubt, through the slow erosion of my personal life. My marriage didn't survive year 7. Sarah, my wife, had warned me. "You're choosing them over us," she'd said one night, tears streaming down her face. "Emma doesn't even know who you are anymore." I'd promised to change, to find balance. But promises made at midnight after 16-hour days are hollow. The divorce papers came the week I closed the biggest deal of my career. I signed them in my office, between conference calls, barely feeling anything. I had become numb to everything except work. When I landed the director of operations role at 35, I felt unstoppable. The announcement came during our quarterly all-hands meeting, Marcus himself walking me up to the stage. "This man," Marcus said, his hand on my shoulder, "embodies everything Virion stands for. Dedication, excellence, results." The applause was thunderous. I looked out at hundreds of faces and felt validated, vindicated, complete. HR even told me afterward, "You're the backbone of this place, Ethan. The company runs because you make it run." Denise from HR, a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, shook my hand firmly. "We're lucky to have you." Funny, right? Because less than a year later, those same lips would call me toxic. But standing there in that moment, receiving congratulations from colleagues, I believed I had finally made it. The new role came with serious responsibility. I oversaw 3 departments, managed a budget of $40 million, and reported directly to the C-suite. My team grew to 75 people, many of whom I had personally hired and mentored. I implemented new systems, streamlined processes, and saved the company millions in operational costs. My performance reviews were flawless. My bonus checks reflected my value. Everything pointed toward continued success, toward VP, toward the executive suite itself. But power in corporate America is a strange thing. The higher you climb, the thinner the air, the more enemies you accumulate without even knowing it. I was too busy executing to notice the political landscape shifting beneath my feet. I was too focused on results to see the jealous glances, the whispered complaints, the quiet resentment building among those I had surpassed. I thought competence and loyalty were enough. I was catastrophically wrong. It started with whispers I wasn't supposed to hear. People I'd mentored for years started avoiding me in hallways, their eyes darting away when I approached. Conversations would stop abruptly when I entered break rooms. My assistant, Kevin, a sharp 26-year-old I'd hired fresh from college, became nervous around me, jumping when I asked simple questions. Meetings where I used to lead strategy discussions. Suddenly, I wasn't invited. My calendar would show a recurring executive planning session. Then, without explanation, the invite would disappear. When I asked Carla, now a VP herself, about it, she'd wave dismissively. "Oh, just some preliminary stuff. We'll loop you in when it's more concrete." But concrete updates never came. Then one Monday morning, my email access glitched. I was trying to review the quarterly budget report when my screen went black. A message popped up in red letters. Access denied. Contact HR immediately. My stomach dropped like a stone. In 11 years, I had never seen that message. I called IT, my hands already trembling. "Yeah, Ethan," the tech support guy said, his voice uncomfortable. "I'm showing your access was restricted this morning. You need to talk to Denise in HR. I can't help you." I walked to HR in a daze, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe there was a security update. Maybe my account had been compromised. But deep down, in that place we reserve for truths we're not ready to face, I knew. Something had fundamentally changed. When I reached HR, Denise's assistant wouldn't meet my eyes. "She's expecting you," the young woman said softly. "Conference room B." The conference room was cold. Too cold. The air conditioning must have been set to Arctic. Or maybe it was just my body going into shock, blood draining from my extremities as my fight-or-flight response kicked in. Across the table sat Denise from HR, that same tight smile from my promotion party now looking predatory, and her colleague Richard, a man I'd never liked, who took notes with disturbing efficiency. "Ethan," Denise began, folding her hands on the table like a disappointed principal. "Thank you for coming. We've received multiple complaints about your conduct." She paused on that word, letting it hang in the air like an accusation. "Conduct," I repeated, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "What conduct? What complaints?" My mind raced through recent interactions, searching for anything that could be misconstrued, any conversation that could be twisted. "Yes," she continued, sliding a thin folder toward me. "You've been described as difficult, intimidating, even toxic." The word hit me like a physical blow. Toxic. The label that ends careers, that stains reputations permanently. Several team members have expressed concern about your management style, your aggressive approach to deadlines, your inability to accept feedback, your tendency to dominate meetings. Each accusation was delivered with clinical precision, like a surgeon making incisions. I laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was the kind of laugh that escapes when reality becomes so absurd that your brain short-circuits. "I've worked here 11 years, I said, my voice dropping to something quiet and dangerous. "I've built teams, saved accounts, mentored dozens of people. You're calling me toxic now. Now, after I just delivered our best quarter in company history." Her answer was a shrug. A simple, dismissive shrug that communicated everything I needed to know about my value to this organization. "We're restructuring. Your role is being eliminated. Effective immediately." Those words, effective immediately, meant I wasn't even getting a transition period. I wasn't getting to say goodbye to my team, to finish projects I'd started, to preserve any dignity. I was being erased. They slid a folder across the table, severance agreement written in bold letters across the top. My hands shook as I opened it, scanning the legal language, the clauses, the numbers. $450,000. 18 months of salary. My safety net after more than a decade of loyalty, of sacrificed holidays and missed moments with my daughter. All I had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement, agree not to disparage the company, and walk away quietly. "This is standard," Richard said, his pen clicking rhythmically. "Sign today, and we'll process the first payment within 2 weeks." I looked at the number again. $450,000. It would cover Emma's college tuition, pay off most of my mortgage, give me breathing room to figure out what came next. My pride wanted to fight, to demand explanations, to force them to acknowledge what I'd contributed. But practical Ethan, Father Ethan, defeated Ethan. He picked up the pen. I signed with shaking hands, my signature barely legible. "We'll need your laptop, badge, and building access card," Denise said, already standing up. The meeting was over. 11 years reduced to a 30-minute termination, a signature on a document, and an escort to my office to collect personal items in a cardboard box. The walk of shame past cubicles where former colleagues suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. Kevin, my assistant, looked up as I packed. His eyes were red. "Ethan, I didn't." I held up my hand. "It's okay," I lied. "Take care of yourself." I grabbed the photo of Emma, my father's quote, and a plant Sarah had given me years ago that had somehow survived my neglect. Everything else, awards, certificates, the nameplate that read Director of Operations, I left behind. They were artifacts of a life that no longer existed. But 3 days later, as I was planning how to stretch that severance payment, calculating budgets and timelines, a new email arrived. Not from my Virion account. They'd already deleted that, but to my personal email. The subject line made my blood run cold. Severance payment, status update. I opened it with dread pooling in my stomach. Upon further review, your severance package has been rescinded due to documented violations of company policy and behavior standards that constitute cause for termination. Per Employment Contract Section 7.3, termination for cause negates severance eligibility. This decision is final. In one paragraph, one email, one legal maneuver, they had erased my future. The $450,000 I had counted on, had mentally allocated, had seen as my lifeline gone. I sat in my car for hours in the grocery store parking lot where I'd pulled over after reading that email. The world spun around me, people pushing carts, living normal lives, unaware that mine had just imploded. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I couldn't drive. I couldn't think. I could barely breathe through the crushing weight on my chest. I had a mortgage, $3, $200 a month. A daughter starting college in 6 months, $45,000 a year in tuition alone. Car payments, insurance, medical bills from my father's recent surgery that I'd promised to help with. I'd been living off my director's salary, which was substantial, but I'd also been spending it. Nice dinners trying to make up for lost time with Emma. A new car after my divorce to feel like I had something. Investments in Virion stock, ironically, which had tanked in recent months. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of my empty apartment, watching shadows move across the walls. My reflection in the bathroom mirror at 3 a.m. looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed, defeated, aged. I had given that company everything. My 20s, my marriage, my relationship with my daughter, my health. The stress had given me high blood pressure and occasional chest pains I'd been ignoring. And for the first time in my life, in that dark bathroom at 3 a.m., I whispered to my hollow-eyed reflection, "They'll regret this." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't even anger yet. It was something colder, more calculated. A promise. A vow. They had taken everything from me. Now I would take everything from them. Not their money, though that would come. Their reputation. Their peace of mind. Their certainty that they could destroy people without consequences. Weeks later, a former coworker, Jasmine, texted me. Jasmine was a project manager I'd hired 4 years ago, a brilliant woman who'd always been politically savvy in ways I wasn't. "Ethan, you need to know something," her text read. "They're blaming you for the budget leak to the press last quarter. It's all over the leadership meetings. They're saying you were the source." Budget leak. My mind raced back. 3 months ago, confidential quarterly numbers had appeared in a tech industry blog, embarrassing Virion and tanking the stock price. There had been an internal investigation, but I'd been cleared, or so I thought. I had nothing to do with that leak. I'd never even spoken to that blogger. But suddenly the pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. HR needed a scapegoat. They needed justification for denying my severance, for calling my termination for cause. And I fit perfectly. High salary, $280,000 a year plus bonus, expensive for them to pay out. Too outspoken. I'd questioned the CFO's decisions in meetings, pushed back on budget cuts I thought were short-sighted. Too loyal to be silent. They knew I had relationships throughout the company, that people trusted me, that my version of events would carry weight. So they had constructed a narrative. Difficult. Toxic. Leak source. each label built on the previous one, creating a portrait of an employee who deserved termination, who had violated trust, who had earned this fate. It was elegant in its cruelty, and probably legal enough to survive casual scrutiny. But they had made one critical mistake. They assumed I would take it. They assumed defeat. They had no idea what they'd unleashed. I started digging methodically, obsessively. Every email I'd ever sent or received at Virion, I had forwarded thousands to my personal account over the years, a habit from my early days doing remote work. Meeting notes I'd typed on my personal laptop during video calls. Slack messages I'd screenshotted when they contained important decisions or approvals. 11 years of digital breadcrumbs that painted a very different picture than the one HR was selling. I created a timeline in Excel, cross-referencing dates, projects, outcomes. Every successful initiative I'd led. Every crisis I'd resolved. Every glowing performance review and bonus memo. The documentary evidence of my actual performance versus the false narrative they were constructing. I worked on this for hours each night, Emma asleep in the next room, my apartment dark except for the glow of my laptop screen. Then I remembered something that made my hands stop typing. The HR meeting. The final conversation where Denise had told me I was being terminated. I had recorded it. Not intentionally, at least not maliciously. 6 months earlier, I'd enabled automatic recording on my laptop for remote team meetings, a feature I'd set up to help review discussions and capture action items. I'd forgotten to turn it off. That setting had been running in the background during the HR meeting, the laptop closed but active in my bag. My heart pounded as I searched my cloud storage. There, a file dated to that terrible Monday. Meeting_recording_conference_room_b.m4a. I downloaded it with trembling fingers, pulled up the audio software, and hit play. The quality was muffled, the laptop having been in my bag, but the voices were unmistakable. The first few minutes were pleasantries, the setup, my voice asking what this meeting was about. Then Denise's voice, clear despite the muffled quality. Ethan, thank you for coming. We've received multiple complaints. I fast-forwarded through sections I remembered, looking for anything useful, anything damning. And then, at the 43-minute mark, I found gold. The recording captured a moment after I'd been escorted from the conference room. I must have left my bag behind briefly. I vaguely remembered Denise saying she'd bring it to security for me. In that 3-minute window, she'd had a conversation with Richard, not realizing my laptop was still recording. Denise's voice, no longer measured and professional. That went better than expected. He signed without even reading it carefully. Richard's reply. Good. If we call him toxic, we won't have to pay him out. Legal said as long as we document behavioral issues, termination for cause is defensible. It's easier that way. A pause. Then a man's voice I recognized as our CFO, Martin Chambers, entering the room. Is it done? Denise, signed and sealed. We'll send the rescission letter in a few days, after he's had time to exhale. Martin coldly. Perfect. Make sure there's no trace. Delete the real performance reviews, substitute the ones we drafted. The timeline needs to be airtight. My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth would crack. I replayed that section 5 times, each time the words hitting harder. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't corporate restructuring. This was a coordinated fraud. They had fabricated cause for my termination to steal my severance. They had planned it, executed it, and congratulated themselves on their efficiency. I had just found my weapon, and I was going to use it to destroy them. I didn't go to the press. Not yet. That would be satisfying but short-sighted. I needed to build an airtight case, the kind that wouldn't just embarrass Virion, but legally demolish them. I spent weeks collecting proof, falsified performance documents that contradicted earlier versions I'd saved, internal memos showing the planning of my termination, timestamps proving the fabrication timeline. Jasmine helped quietly from the inside. She was careful, scared for her own job, but morally outraged enough to feed me information. They've started doing this to others, she texted one night. 2 more people last month. Same script. Sudden behavioral issues, immediate termination, rescinded severance. It's a pattern, Ethan. That information was crucial. This wasn't just about me. It was systemic fraud. Multiple victims meant class action potential, which meant bigger damages, more attorney interest, more pressure. We called it Operation Closure, dark humor for dark work. Jasmine would photograph documents on her phone in bathroom stalls. I would cross-reference them with my archives, building a comprehensive narrative. We met in coffee shops far from downtown, spoke in careful euphemisms, paid in cash. I felt like a spy, but I was just a former employee seeking justice. Seeking what was owed. Seeking revenge that was righteous because it was grounded in truth. I also started documenting my job search, the rejection letters, the closed doors. We heard about the circumstances of your departure from Virion. One recruiter said carefully. The toxic label had spread. My reputation, built over 11 years, had been destroyed in weeks. That damage, reputational harm, would be part of my lawsuit too. They hadn't just stolen my severance. They'd stolen my future earning potential. Finding the right lawyer took time. Most employment attorneys I consulted were interested but cautious. Corporate fraud cases are hard, one said. Without smoking gun evidence, it's your word against theirs. Then I met Michael Torres, a shark of a lawyer whose father had been screwed by a corporation decades earlier. He took cases like mine personally. "Show me what you have," he said, skepticism evident. I played him the recording. I showed him the documents. I walked him through the timeline with the precision of someone who'd lived in those details for months. When I finished, Michael was silent for a long moment. Then he looked up at me, something like admiration in his eyes. "Ethan," he said slowly, "this isn't just unethical. This is criminal fraud. Wire fraud, potentially. Conspiracy. RICO if we can prove it's systemic. You're not just suing for wrongful termination. We're going after the entire executive team." We filed the lawsuit 2 days later. The complaint was 93 pages long, meticulously detailed. Corporate fraud. Retaliation. Defamation. Breach of contract. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. We named Virion Tech, Denise, Richard, and CFO Martin Chambers as defendants. We requested compensatory damages, punitive damages, attorney fees, and injunctive relief requiring policy changes. We attached key exhibits, the recording, the falsified documents, the pattern of similar terminations. When the process server delivered the complaint to Virion's registered agent, Michael called me. "It's done," he said. "Now comes the silence before the storm breaks." That night I slept better than I had in months. Not because I knew I'd win. Lawsuits are unpredictable. Justice uncertain. But because I had fought back. Because I hadn't accepted defeat. Because they would learn that destroying lives has consequences. Even in corporate America, where consequences are rare. The response was immediate and chaotic. I heard through Jasmine, who was now feeding me real-time intelligence despite the risk to her own career. "Virion's in meltdown," she texted. "Emergency executive sessions. Lawyers everywhere. Denise is panicking, apparently shredding papers in her office. IT's been ordered to conduct routine server maintenance. Code for deleting potentially damaging files. But they forgot one thing that would prove fatal. Everything digital leaves a shadow. Even deleted emails live in backup servers. Destroyed documents leave metadata trails. And I had copies of most of it anyway." Michael immediately filed for an injunction preventing document destruction, citing evidence spoliation. The judge granted it within 48 hours, sending U.S. Marshals to Virion to preserve electronic records. The sight of federal agents walking into that gleaming office building apparently sent shockwaves through the company. Jasmine sent photos, Denise being escorted from her office by security, a box of belongings in her arms. Richard being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The CFO, Martin, hiring a criminal defense attorney, not just civil representation. "It's like a bomb went off," Jasmine wrote. "People are scared. Rumors are flying. Your name is everywhere. Some people are calling you a hero. Others think you're vindictive. But everyone agrees, you actually did it." The local press picked up the story. "Tech company faces fraud allegations from former executive," read the headline in the business section. The article was careful, legally vetted, but the implications were clear. Virion stock dropped 7% in 2 days. Clients started asking questions. Recruits canceled interviews. The damage I had hoped to inflict was manifesting faster than even I had anticipated. And we were just getting started. When the subpoena hit requiring testimony from key executives, the board called an emergency session. This wasn't normal corporate litigation that could be handled by lawyers and PR teams. This was existential threat, criminal implications, regulatory interest, reputational catastrophe. I was invited to provide a deposition, but Michael negotiated something better: direct testimony to the board of directors. Walking into that glass building again, after 6 months felt surreal. The same security desk where I'd turned in my badge. The same elevators I'd ridden thousands of times. The same hallways where I'd walked with purpose, with belonging. But now I was an invader, an enemy, escorted by my attorney and accompanied by a court reporter. Employees I'd worked with for years averted their eyes as I passed. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked away in what might have been shame. The boardroom was on the 19th floor, all glass walls and expansive views of the city. 8 board members sat around the massive table. Serious people with serious money and serious concerns about liability. Denise was there, looking diminished somehow, her perfect composure cracked. Richard sat beside her, taking notes but refusing to meet anyone's eyes. And Martin, the CFO who had orchestrated this, sat at the far end looking defiant, like he could still brazen his way through. Michael set up the audio equipment carefully, officially, making sure everything was properly recorded for the record. "We'll play Exhibit A," he announced. "The recording from conference room B on the date of Mr. Manning's termination." He pressed play, and the voices filled the room. My termination. Then the critical conversation after I'd left, captured by accident, but presented now with devastating intentionality. The CEO's face turned white as the recording played. Marcus Holloway, the man who had promoted me, who had called me the backbone of Virion, looked like he'd been physically struck. When Denise's voice said, "If we call him toxic, we won't have to pay him out," Marcus's hands clenched into fists on the table. When Martin's voice instructed to make sure there's no trace, Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. "Is this real?" he demanded, looking at Denise, at Martin, at the corporate counsel sitting pale-faced at the side of the room. "Tell me this is somehow fabricated, edited, taken out of context." No one answered. The silence stretched on, heavy with guilt and implication. Denise opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Marcus, it was a difficult situation. We had to make tough decisions about." "Tough decisions?" Marcus's voice rose, actual anger breaking through his usual calculated composure. "You committed fraud. You fabricated cause for termination to steal an employee's severance. You destroyed a man's career and reputation to save the company $500,000. He turned to the board chair, a silver-haired woman named Patricia who sat stone-faced. "Did you know about this?" Patricia shook her head. "We were told it was a standard termination for behavioral issues." Then Marcus did something I never expected. He looked at me, the man they called toxic, the man they'd erased, the man they'd thought would disappear quietly. And he said, his voice breaking slightly, "You deserved better, Ethan. So much better. I'm sorry." Those words, coming from him in front of the entire board, should have felt like vindication. Instead, they felt hollow. Because apologies don't erase months of hell. They don't restore what was taken. They don't undo damage done. But they were a start. The board went into closed session after an hour of testimony. Michael and I waited in a conference room, drinking bad coffee, not talking much. "That went well," he finally said. "Better than well." Marcus's reaction, the board's shock, that's genuine. They didn't know. Which means we can potentially settle with the company separately from the individuals. Divide and conquer. I nodded, barely processing. I was emotionally exhausted, running on fumes and vindication and residual rage. Within a week, HR was dissolved as a department. Not just restructured, dissolved. Every employee in that division was let go or reassigned. An outside firm was brought in to rebuild the function from scratch. Denise was fired, not just from her position but from the company entirely, with no severance. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Richard was fired. Investigations were launched into every termination from the past 2 years. But the biggest bombshell was Martin Chambers, the CFO. He didn't just resign, he was criminally charged. Federal prosecutors, alerted by our lawsuit and the evidence we'd provided, decided the fraud was egregious enough to warrant charges. Wire fraud for the electronic transmission of the rescission letter. Conspiracy for coordinating the scheme. The U.S. attorney held a press conference using words like systemic, deliberate, and unconscionable. But I didn't feel joy. Not yet. Revenge is never clean. It's messy and complicated and leaves you feeling strangely empty even when you win. I had wanted them destroyed, wanted them to suffer as I had suffered. And now, watching the pieces fall, I realized destruction doesn't heal wounds. It just creates different ones. Denise had 2 kids, I'd heard. Richard was a single dad. Were they guilty? Absolutely. Justice uncertain. but because I had fought back, because I hadn't accepted defeat, because they would learn that destroying lives has consequences, even in corporate America, where consequences are rare. The response was immediate and chaotic. I heard through Jasmine, who was now feeding me real-time intelligence despite the risk to her own career. Virion's in meltdown, she texted. Emergency executive sessions. Lawyers everywhere. Denise is panicking, apparently shredding papers in her office. IT's been ordered to conduct routine server maintenance, code for deleting potentially damaging files. But they forgot one thing that would prove fatal. Everything digital leaves a shadow. Even deleted emails live in backup servers. Destroyed documents leave metadata trails. And I had copies of most of it anyway. Michael immediately filed for an injunction preventing document destruction, citing evidence spoliation. The judge granted it within 48 hours, sending U.S. Marshals to Virion to preserve electronic records. The sight of federal agents walking into that gleaming office building apparently sent shockwaves through the company. Jasmine sent photos, Denise being escorted from her office by security, a box of belongings in her arms. Richard being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The CFO, Martin, hiring a criminal defense attorney, not just civil representation. It's like a bomb went off, Jasmine wrote. People are scared. Rumors are flying. Your name is everywhere. Some people are calling you a hero. Others think you're vindictive. But everyone agrees, you actually did it. The local press picked up the story. Tech company faces fraud allegations from former executive, read the headline in the business section. The article was careful, legally vetted, but the implications were clear. Virion stock dropped 7% in 2 days. Clients started asking questions. Recruits canceled interviews. The damage I had hoped to inflict was manifesting faster than even I had anticipated. And we were just getting started. When the subpoena hit requiring testimony from key executives, the board called an emergency session. This wasn't normal corporate litigation that could be handled by lawyers and PR teams. This was existential threat, criminal implications, regulatory interest, reputational catastrophe. I was invited to provide a deposition, but Michael negotiated something better, direct testimony to the board of directors. Walking into that glass building again after 6 months felt surreal. The same security desk where I'd turned in my badge. The same elevators I'd ridden thousands of times. The same hallways where I'd walked with purpose, with belonging. But now I was an invader, an enemy, escorted by my attorney and accompanied by a court reporter. Employees I'd worked with for years averted their eyes as I passed. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked away in what might have been shame. The boardroom was on the 19th floor, all glass walls and expansive views of the city. 8 board members sat around the massive table. Serious people with serious money and serious concerns about liability. Denise was there, looking diminished somehow, her perfect composure cracked. Richard sat beside her, taking notes but refusing to meet anyone's eyes. And Martin, the CFO who had orchestrated this, sat at the far end looking defiant, like he could still brazen his way through. Michael set up the audio equipment carefully, officially, making sure everything was properly recorded for the record. We'll play Exhibit A, he announced. The recording from conference room B on the date of Mr. Manning's termination. He pressed play, and the voices filled the room. My termination. Then the critical conversation after I'd left, captured by accident, but presented now with devastating intentionality. The CEO's face turned white as the recording played. Marcus Holloway, the man who had promoted me, who had called me the backbone of Virion, looked like he'd been physically struck. When Denise's voice said, "If we call him toxic, we won't have to pay him out," Marcus's hands clenched into fists on the table. When Martin's voice instructed to make sure there's no trace, Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. "Is this real?" he demanded, looking at Denise, at Martin, at the corporate counsel sitting pale-faced at the side of the room. "Tell me this is somehow fabricated, edited, taken out of context." No one answered. The silence stretched on, heavy with guilt and implication. Denise opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Marcus, it was a difficult situation. We had to make tough decisions about." "Tough decisions?" Marcus's voice rose, actual anger breaking through his usual calculated composure. "You committed fraud. You fabricated cause for termination to steal an employee's severance. You destroyed a man's career and reputation to save the company $500,000. He turned to the board chair, a silver-haired woman named Patricia who sat stone-faced. Did you know about this? Patricia shook her head. We were told it was a standard termination for behavioral issues. Then Marcus did something I never expected. He looked at me. The man they called toxic, the man they'd erased, the man they'd thought would disappear quietly. And he said, his voice breaking slightly, "You deserved better, Ethan. So much better. I'm sorry." Those words, coming from him in front of the entire board, should have felt like vindication. Instead, they felt hollow. Because apologies don't erase months of hell. They don't restore what was taken. They don't undo damage done. But they were a start. The board went into closed session after an hour of testimony. Michael and I waited in a conference room, drinking bad coffee, not talking much. "That went well," he finally said. "Better than well." Marcus's reaction, the board's shock, that's genuine. They didn't know. Which means we can potentially settle with the company separately from the individuals. Divide and conquer. I nodded, barely processing. I was emotionally exhausted, running on fumes and vindication and residual rage. Within a week, HR was dissolved as a department. Not just restructured, dissolved. Every employee in that division was let go or reassigned. An outside firm was brought in to rebuild the function from scratch. Denise was fired, not just from her position but from the company entirely, with no severance. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Richard was fired. Investigations were launched into every termination from the past 2 years. But the biggest bombshell was Martin Chambers, the CFO. He didn't just resign, he was criminally charged. Federal prosecutors, alerted by our lawsuit and the evidence we'd provided, decided the fraud was egregious enough to warrant charges. Wire fraud for the electronic transmission of the rescission letter. Conspiracy for coordinating the scheme. The U.S. attorney held a press conference using words like systemic, deliberate, and unconscionable. But I didn't feel joy. Not yet. Revenge is never clean. It's messy and complicated and leaves you feeling strangely empty even when you win. I had wanted them destroyed, wanted them to suffer as I had suffered. And now, watching the pieces fall, I realized destruction doesn't heal wounds. It just creates different ones. Denise had 2 kids, I'd heard. Richard was a single dad. Were they guilty? Absolutely. Did they deserve consequences? Yes. But watching careers end, families disrupted, lives altered, there was no triumph in it. Just grim satisfaction that justice, at least, was being served. Emma asked me one night, "Dad, are you happy now?" I looked at my daughter, now 17, wise beyond her years from watching her parents divorce and her father spiral through crisis. "I'm satisfied," I told her honestly. "Happy is different. Happy will take longer." She hugged me then, and for the first time in a year, I felt like maybe I could get there. Maybe destruction wasn't the end goal. Maybe reconstruction of my life, my career, myself, was what actually mattered. A month later, Michael called with the news I'd been waiting for. Virion wants to settle, privately, quickly, and generously. We met in his office, documents spread across his conference table. The offer was substantial. Not just the $450,000 they'd stolen, but 3 times that, $1.35 million, plus legal fees, which had climbed to nearly $200,000, plus a letter of recommendation from Marcus himself, plus an agreement to seal the records, though the criminal charges against Martin would proceed separately. I looked at the numbers, and something in me unclenched. This wasn't about the money, not really. I would have fought for principle alone, for justice, for the satisfaction of proving they were wrong. But the money meant security. It meant Emma's college fully paid for. It meant I could take time to figure out what came next without panic. It meant they acknowledged, in the most concrete way possible, that they had wronged me. "What do you think?" Michael asked, watching me carefully. I thought about continuing the fight, taking this all the way to trial, forcing public testimony, maximizing humiliation. Part of me wanted that. The vindictive part, the hurt part, the part that still woke up angry. But another part, the part that wanted to move forward, to heal, to build something new, that part was tired of fighting. "I'll agree," I said finally. Not for the money, but for closure. Real closure. Michael nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes knowing you won is enough," he said. "Sometimes you don't have to salt the earth completely. Sometimes mercy is the final victory." He was right. We signed the settlement 3 days later. The money hit my account a week after that. And for the first time since that terrible Monday when they called me toxic, I felt like I could breathe. Before the final deal closed, before the legal machinery ground to completion, I wrote a letter to Marcus. Not for the settlement, that was already done. Not for inclusion in any legal record. But for myself, to articulate everything I'd felt, everything I'd learned, everything I wanted to say to the man who had once told me I embodied Virion's values. Marcus, I wrote by hand, old-fashioned pen on paper. I gave this company everything. My 20s and most of my 30s. My marriage. My relationship with my daughter. My health. I believed in the mission, in the culture, in the promise that hard work and loyalty mattered. You called me toxic because I cared too much, because I questioned decisions that hurt the company, because I became inconvenient to people protecting their own interests. I continued, but here's what you need to understand. Loyalty doesn't make you weak. It makes you dangerous when betrayed. A loyal employee will work themselves into the ground for you. But betray that loyalty, and they become your worst nightmare. Someone who knows exactly where the bodies are buried because they helped dig the holes. You didn't lose an employee when you let HR destroy me. You created an enemy, and that enemy almost destroyed you back. The letter concluded, I hope you rebuild Virion into something better. I hope you learn that culture isn't what you put on motivational posters. It's how you treat people when treating them well is expensive. I hope no one else has to go through what I went through. But mostly, I hope you remember me whenever you're tempted to let politics override principles. Remember that the person you're sacrificing might be the one who actually cared. Best wishes, Ethan. I mailed it certified mail, signature required. Marcus never replied directly, but 3 weeks later I received a package. Inside was a company gift I'd been given years ago, a glass sculpture of the Virion logo. It had sat on my desk for years before I'd left it behind in my termination box. Along with it was a note in Marcus's handwriting. You deserve to keep this. You earned it more than any of us. M. It sits on my desk now, a reminder of what I survived, what I achieved, and what I became. In the quiet months that followed the settlement, I took time to breathe for what felt like the first time in 15 years. I started running again, something I'd abandoned in my Virion years when work consumed everything. 5 miles every morning through my neighborhood, watching the sunrise, letting my mind wander. The physical exhaustion was cleansing somehow, burning away residual anger. I cooked dinner for Emma regularly, relearning recipes I'd forgotten, experimenting with cuisines I'd never had time for. We'd sit at the kitchen table for hours, talking about her college plans, her dreams, her anxieties. I'm proud of you, Dad, she said one night, apropos of nothing, for fighting back, for not just taking it. Her words meant more than any settlement check. For the first time in years, I wasn't checking my email at midnight, wasn't responding to Slack messages during dinner, wasn't sacrificing sleep for quarterly reviews. The tether that had connected me to Virion, that had defined my identity for more than a decade, was severed. And in that severance, I found something unexpected, freedom. The terrifying, exhilarating, disorienting freedom to decide what came next without the weight of corporate expectations. I traveled, something I'd always promised myself I'd do someday. Emma and I went to Italy for 2 weeks, wandering through Rome and Florence and Venice. We ate gelato and got lost in winding streets and laughed at our terrible attempts to speak Italian. In the Sistine Chapel, staring up at Michelangelo's ceiling, I felt something shift. Beauty existed beyond conference rooms. Meaning existed beyond quarterly earnings. Life existed beyond the narrow confines I'd built for myself. Therapy helped too. I found a counselor named Dr. Patricia Chun who specialized in career trauma and identity reconstruction. You've tied your entire sense of self to your work, she observed in our 3rd session. When they took that away, they took your identity. Now you get to rebuild it consciously, intentionally, based on who you actually are, not just what you produce. Those sessions were harder than any negotiation I'd ever conducted, excavating wounds I'd buried, acknowledging losses I'd never properly mourned. Weeks after settling, as I was building this new life, Jasmine forwarded me a message that stopped me cold. It was an internal memo from Virion, sent to all employees, subject line, commitment to ethical excellence. I opened the PDF with trembling hands. To the Virion community, it began. Recent events have forced us to confront serious failures in our HR practices and leadership accountability. We regret the mishandling of internal severance cases and the treatment of valued employees who dedicated years of service to this company. A comprehensive review is underway, led by external consultants, to ensure these failures never happen again. We are implementing new policies for termination transparency, severance administration, and employee advocacy. We owe it to everyone who works here to do better. No names were mentioned. No specific acknowledgement of what they'd done to me, to the others Jasmine had mentioned. But I knew that paragraph was for me. I could read between the corporate speak, the careful legal language designed to acknowledge wrong without admitting liability. "We regret the mishandling," was the closest thing to an apology I'd get from an institution. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Jasmine texted, "You changed this place. People talk about you like a legend. The guy who actually fought back and won. The policies they're implementing, anonymous reporting, severance audits, management accountability reviews, that's all because of you." I read her message multiple times, trying to process what it meant. I hadn't set out to be a reformer, just to get what was owed to me. But reform had happened anyway, collateral benefit of my survival. I printed the memo and added it to a folder I'd started keeping, artifacts of the battle, the termination letter, the settlement agreement, the newspaper articles, the memo. Someday, I thought, I'd look back at these and remember not just the pain but the strength it took to endure. Not just the betrayal but the justice that followed. Not just what they took, but what I took back. 3 months post-settlement, a journalist named Rachel Kim from a national business publication called. "Mr. Manning," she said, "I've been following your story. The Virion case. What happened to you is happening to thousands of people across corporate America. Sudden terminations, fabricated cause, stolen severance. But most people don't have the resources or evidence to fight back. Your story's inspiring. Can we feature it?" I hesitated, the NDA and settlement terms flashing through my mind. But Michael had been careful. We'd negotiated the right to discuss the case factually, without disparagement, as long as I didn't reveal specific settlement terms. "What would the article say?" I asked. Rachel explained, a long-form piece about corporate accountability, the vulnerability of even high-performing employees, the systemic nature of HR abuses. My story as case study, not expose. I said yes, not to gloat, but to warn others. I told her when we met for the interview. We sat in a coffee shop for 3 hours, my story pouring out in ways it hadn't even in therapy. The betrayal, the investigation, the recording that changed everything. Rachel took notes furiously, asking sharp questions, pushing me to articulate not just what happened, but what it meant. "What do you want people to take from this?" she finally asked. "Document everything," I said immediately. "Forward emails to personal accounts. Save performance reviews. Record conversations when legal. Build relationships outside your direct management chain. Never let one person control your entire narrative. And if they come for you unjustly, fight back. It's terrifying and expensive and exhausting, but it's worth it. Because people who abuse power rely on their victims staying silent. Silence enables the next abuse, the next victim. Speaking up isn't just about you. It's about everyone who comes after." When the article came out 2 weeks later, the response was overwhelming. The publication's website crashed from traffic. Thousands of comments flooded in. People sharing their own stories of betrayal, thanking me for giving them language for their experiences, asking for advice. My inbox exploded with messages. Some were from lawyers offering to take similar cases. Others were from victims looking for hope. A few were from HR professionals disgusted by what their profession had become, wanting to be part of the solution. One message stood out from a woman named Claire. "I was fired last month. Called not a culture fit after 6 years and glowing reviews. They're denying my severance. I was about to give up, accept it, move on. Then I read your story. I'm going to fight. Thank you for showing me it's possible." I wrote back immediately, connected her with Michael's firm, offered whatever guidance I could. If my nightmare could prevent even one person from suffering similarly, it was worth reliving. A year after the settlement, I started Manning Consulting Group, a deliberately ironic name, using my surname that Virion had tried to tarnish. We specialized in corporate culture, ethics, and employee relations. But we weren't typical consultants selling feel-good platitudes. We were reformed cynics who'd seen the dark underbelly, offering hard-earned wisdom about what actually worked versus what sounded good in PowerPoints. Our first client was a mid-sized tech company whose CEO had read Rachel's article. "We don't want to become the next Virion," he told me candidly. "Help us build systems that protect employees and the company." We conducted a comprehensive audit, interviewed employees at all levels, reviewed termination patterns, examined HR policies, analyzed the incentive structures that encouraged or prevented abuse. What we found was sobering but fixable. The recommendations we delivered were radical. Transparent termination criteria published internally, mandatory cooling-off periods between termination decisions and execution, third-party severance arbitration, anonymous ethics hotlines with guaranteed investigation, manager accountability scoring that affected compensation. This will slow down our ability to make quick personnel decisions, the CFO objected. Good, I replied. Quick decisions destroy lives. Slow decisions save companies from lawsuits. They implemented 70% of our recommendations. 6 months later, their employee retention had improved dramatically, their Glassdoor rating had jumped 2 points, and they'd avoided 3 potential lawsuits by catching problems early. Word spread. More clients came. Companies scared of their own Virion moment, leaders genuinely wanting to do better, boards seeking insurance against reputational catastrophe. Within a year, we had 15 consultants and annual revenue exceeding $3 million. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man once branded toxic, now teaching integrity. But maybe that was the point. I understood both sides now. I knew what drove companies to cut corners, to sacrifice individuals for quarterly numbers, to prioritize short-term savings over long-term culture. And I knew, viscerally, what it cost the people on the receiving end. That dual perspective made me effective in ways traditional consultants couldn't match. I'd earned my expertise in fire. One morning, about 18 months after my termination, I was working in a cafe near my apartment when I saw her. Denise. She looked older, smaller somehow. The polished veneer I remembered had worn away, revealing someone who looked tired and defeated. She was standing in line for coffee, hadn't seen me yet. My first instinct was to leave, to avoid the confrontation. My second instinct was anger. She didn't deserve peaceful coffee breaks after what she'd done. But I stayed seated, watching her. She paid for her order, turned, and our eyes met. Recognition flashed across her face, followed by something that looked like fear, then resignation. She walked over slowly, coffee cup trembling slightly in her hands. "Ethan," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." 2 words. Inadequate, insufficient, too late. But also somehow necessary. "Sorry for what specifically?" I asked, my voice harder than I intended. "For following orders? For fabricating cause? For stealing my severance? For nearly destroying my career and reputation? Which part are you sorry for?" She flinched at each accusation, but didn't look away. "All of it," she said simply. "I was wrong. I was scared of losing my own job, of pushing back against Martin and the executives. I told myself I was just doing my job. But I was lying to myself. And to you." I looked at her, really looked. Saw the genuine remorse in her eyes, the weight she'd been carrying. This wasn't the performative corporate apology, the carefully worded non-apology. This was real. "What happened to you?" I asked, my anger softening slightly. She gave a bitter laugh. "After I was fired, I couldn't find work for 8 months. The industry's small. Word spread. I was the HR person who committed fraud. Who would hire me? I finally got a job at a small company, entry-level, 40% pay cut. I'm rebuilding like you had to." We stood there in uncomfortable silence, 2 people whose lives had collided catastrophically. "I forgive you," I finally said, the words surprising even me. "But I'll never forget. What you did was wrong. You knew it was wrong while you were doing it, and you did it anyway. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. You chose your career over my life. I forgive you because carrying anger hurts me more than you. But we're not friends. We're not even acquaintances. We're just 2 people who learned hard lessons." "That's fair," she said quietly. "More than fair. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. And that what you did, fighting back, exposing us, it taught me something about accountability I should have learned earlier. Thank you for that, even though it destroyed my career." Then she walked away, and I watched her go. I felt lighter somehow, as if forgiving her had released something I'd been holding on to without realizing it. 6 months after the cafe encounter, I was invited to speak at the National HR Leadership Summit in Chicago, a gathering of 1,500 HR professionals from across the country. The invitation itself was ironic, given that HR had been my adversary. But the conference organizers wanted a cautionary tale, a voice from the other side, someone who could challenge the profession to do better. Standing backstage, waiting to go on, I felt the old nervousness return. Not stage fright. I'd given hundreds of presentations at Virion. But vulnerability. I was about to share my story with the very people whose peers had destroyed me. Some would be defensive, others hostile. Some might actually listen. I took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. My name is Ethan Manning, I began, and 2 years ago, HR called me toxic, fabricated cause for my termination, and stole $450,000 in severance I'd earned over 11 years of dedication. Today, I'm here to tell you why that happened, what I did about it, and what you need to change to prevent it from happening in your organizations. The room was silent. I could feel the tension, the defensiveness, the curiosity. I told my story, abbreviated but honest. The recording, the lawsuit, the settlement, the aftermath. Then I pivoted to the systemic issues. This wasn't about one bad HR person. It was about incentive structures that reward cost-cutting over ethics. It was about executives who see employees as line items rather than people. It was about a profession that's lost its way, that protects companies from employees instead of protecting both. A company's culture isn't tested when things go right, I continued, my voice strengthening. It's tested when loyalty costs money, when keeping a promise is expensive, when doing the right thing conflicts with quarterly earnings. That's when you see what leadership actually values. Not in mission statements or values posters, but in how they treat people when treating them well is inconvenient. I looked out at the audience, saw some nodding, others uncomfortable, a few taking notes. You have a choice, I said. You can be compliance officers protecting companies from employees, or you can be advocates protecting companies and employees from each other. You can enable the Martins and Denises of the world, or you can be the person who says, "No, we're not doing this." That choice defines whether you're part of the problem or part of the solution. The speech ended with standing ovation, not unanimous, but significant. Afterward, dozens of HR professionals approached me, some to apologize for their profession, others to share their own stories of being pressured to do unethical things, a few to argue that I was too harsh, that HR faces impossible pressures. But the overwhelming response was gratitude for saying what many of them had been thinking but couldn't articulate. One woman, maybe 35, with tears in her eyes, shook my hand. I was asked to fabricate a performance issue last week to justify terminating someone, she said quietly. I was planning to do it. I needed my job. But after hearing you, I'm going to refuse, even if it costs me. Because you're right, we have to be part of the solution. That conversation alone made the vulnerability worthwhile. Now, 3 years after that terrible Monday when they called me toxic, when people ask if I'd go back to corporate life, I laugh. Not bitterly anymore, but with genuine amusement at the absurdity of the question. Because the truth is, they didn't break me. They tried. God knows they tried. They took my job, my reputation, my financial security, my peace of mind. They weaponized HR, manipulated systems, fabricated evidence. They did everything right according to the corporate playbook. But they forgot one thing. I was the person who wrote parts of that playbook. I understood their tactics because I'd been part of the machinery. I knew how decisions were made, where evidence lived, what mattered legally versus what sounded good in meetings. They created the perfect storm to destroy me. But in doing so, they built the version of me I was always meant to become. The version that doesn't accept injustice quietly. The version that fights back with precision and documentation and righteous anger. I gave that company everything. My 20s, my marriage, my relationship with my daughter, my health. They called me toxic because I was convenient to eliminate and expensive to keep. But in the end, here's what they discovered. I was the antidote. Not to their business problems, which were real, but to their ethical rot, their cultural disease, their belief that people were disposable and consequences were for other companies. Emma's in college now, studying business ethics of all things. Because of you, Dad, she told me. Because you showed me that doing the right thing is possible even when it's hard. My consulting firm employs 30 people and has worked with over 100 companies. We've prevented dozens of Virion situations, caught HR abuses before they metastasized, helped rebuild cultures after crises. The work matters in ways that quarterly earnings never did. I still have moments of anger, flashes of rage when I remember what they took from me. But mostly I feel grateful. Grateful for the recording that saved me. Grateful for Jasmine's courage. Grateful for Michael's tenacity. Grateful for Emma's patience. Grateful even for the ordeal itself, because it burned away everything false and left something truer, stronger, more purposeful. Last month, Marcus reached out. Virion was doing well, had implemented most of my recommended reforms, wanted to discuss a consulting engagement. "We need someone who understands where we went wrong," he wrote. "We need you." I declined politely. Some bridges, once burned, should stay ashes. But I appreciated the offer, the acknowledgement, the recognition that I'd been right all along. Sometimes late at night, working in my home office, I look at that glass Virion sculpture on my desk. It catches the light from my laptop screen, throwing fractured rainbows across the wall. A monument to what I survived, what I lost, what I became. I could throw it away, erase that chapter completely. But I keep it as a reminder. Loyalty is valuable until it's exploited, then it becomes lethal. To the exploiter, not the loyal. They called me toxic. But toxicity is contextual. Poison to one system is medicine to another. I was toxic to Virion's culture of unaccountability, toxic to executives who valued compliance over courage, toxic to an HR department that had forgotten whom they served. And you know what? I'm okay with that. Better to be the toxin that kills a disease than the patient who dies from it quietly. This is my story. Not a victim's tale, though I was victimized. Not a hero's journey, though I fought back. Just a story about what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept extraordinary injustice. When they document meticulously, fight strategically, and refuse to be erased. When they remember that corporations are just collections of people making choices, and sometimes those choices need consequences. So no, I won't go back to corporate life. Because I've built something better. Something mine. Something that can't be taken away by a bad manager or a scared HR department or an executive protecting quarterly numbers. I've built a life where my value isn't determined by someone else's assessment. Where my worth isn't contingent on quarterly reviews. Where I define success on my own terms. They tried to destroy me. Instead, they set me free. And that, more than any settlement or apology or reformed policy, is the final victory. I'm not the person I was on that first day at Virion, young and ambitious and eager to prove myself. I'm not the person I was in that conference room, signing away my future with shaking hands. I'm someone who walked through fire and came out forged into something stronger. I gave that company everything. They called me toxic. But in the end, I wasn't the poison, I was the antidote. And that makes all the difference.